Valentine's Day 2017 in the seaside city of Virginia Beach. For most young couples, it was a day to celebrate their love for one another.
It's the largest city in Virginia. It's about 450,000 people. It's a very safe city. As far as homicides, there's maybe 14 to 20 a year, which I don't think is that high for a city as large as it is. So it's a pretty good, safe place to live.
The 35-year-old mother of one, Ellie Tran, however, Cupid's arrow was a stainless steel syringe filled with cyanide, dispatched by her former boyfriend and father of her child, Joseph Molino III.
I believe he wanted custody of their daughter, but I think more than anything, it was revenge. It was, if I'm not gonna have her, no one else is. Kill someone that you were in love with on Valentine's Day, that's not an attack that, you know, a stranger is gonna do. That's a very passionate crime.
Ellie Tran had been married to a Vietnamese-American man. When the couple divorced, Ellie moved to Virginia Beach, where she swiftly established herself, working 2 jobs to save up money and making friends. It was at a social function when she met fellow guest Joseph Molino.
I think maybe an adolescent, and he ended up living with his father, and he was named after his father. From what I understand, he was very close to his father, but there was a time when he stopped going to school and he was homeschooled. And I heard from someone in the neighborhood that I believe he was being bullied and that's the reason why he stopped. Ellie's mother told me that they met at a wedding, and it was a mutual friend who introduced them. And apparently it sounds like Molino was infatuated with her from the moment he saw her. And he kept asking for her phone number. And her mother said that she was hesitant, didn't want to give it to him, but he was so relentless that she finally did. And I'm sure it obviously became something that she regretted later.
In the spring of 2014, Ellie became pregnant with daughter Jolie. But after 2 abusive years, Ellie split with Joseph.
Apparently Joseph was rather controlling over Ellie. This was an untenable situation for her to live in.
She had filed at least a couple police reports against him and had sought out a protective order because he had become physically and emotionally and verbally abusive with her.
Ellie had managed to remove herself and her daughter from Molino's abusive and controlling grasp. She was now free to reach her goal, to buy a home for them to settle down.
From what I heard, she was a very sweet and loving person, very kind, happy. I think she really loved being here, and she was a very hard worker. I think she worked more than one job, and she was working as a nail technician at a shop in a strip mall at the time that this happened.
Ellie invited her parents to come live with her and help mind daughter Jolie while she worked.
So she was supporting herself, her daughter, and her parents. Her father did work, but Ellie, I think, was the main breadwinner.
Angry, arrogant, and seeking revenge, Molino's family name would soon be manipulated for his own sinister means.
There is a rather famous mafioso that lived in the northeastern United States that bore the same name. And Joseph had made it known for some period of time that he may or may not be related to this underworld figure. I think that probably this goes to this idea of him being kind of a dark personality where he thought that he could threaten and maybe intimidate people simply by his association with this underworld boss.
Molino began to play out his mobster fantasies once Ellie moved out. Although they no longer lived together, his initial controlling behavior and verbal abuse escalated as the months wore on.
She was leaving work one day, and she apparently was so frightened that people would escort her out. You know, they didn't let her walk out alone. And so a friend was walking with her to her car, and she got into her car and she was backing up, and someone bumped it. So as you typically do in a traffic accident, you get out to go see what's going on. And so that's what happened. And it was Molino, dressed like a woman, wig and dress and all. He threw something at her. It was some type of caustic solution, and she turned, so it didn't get her in the face, but it burned some of her hair.
Molino's viciousness saw him receive a court-mandated restraining order. The law compelled him to stay away from Ellie.
Unfortunately, it didn't work. There's an obvious escalation in his thinking at this point in time. He is put in a position where he is not only not allowed to be in her presence, it's compromised his ability to control her.
But Molino's arrogance knew no boundaries. Incensed, Molino's urge for revenge only rocketed.
I do think that he wanted to get custody of Jolie eventually, but I think that it was more of a revenge type thing, that she had broken up with him, had, refused to reconcile with him. And I think he just was like, if I'm not going to have her, no one else is going to have her.
To execute his viciously vindictive assault on Ellie, Molino sought cyanide.
Death as a result of exposure to cyanide is one of the most horrible sets of circumstances that anyone can imagine. First off, it leads to a shortness of breath. It can cause a dysrhythmic event in the heart. But what actually winds up happening is that the individual goes into respiratory failure. You'll see a white, frothy cone that will literally come from the mouth and begin to issue, and the individual will begin to convulse and die pretty quickly. The nature of cyanide in and of itself is, and the reason that it was used as a method for execution, not only in the state of California, but we can go back to Nazi concentration camps where it was utilized as well, is because it was rather quick and highly effective. It's almost 100% guarantee that the individual is going to succumb pretty rapidly.
Fearing for her own safety and that of her family, Ellie had security cameras installed at the doorway of her home. Instead of protecting her, they would record her fateful, final moments. On the night of February 14th, 2017, Ellie Tran pulled into her driveway and approached her front door.
Her mother was in the kitchen, and she had stopped in to grab a snack, and that's when she heard the screaming. And she ran out, opened the door, and saw Ellie, and Ellie was jumping up and down saying that man stabbed me, that man put something in my leg. And she saw someone walking across the street. And so she helped Ellie to come inside.
Molino's ambush was recorded on Ellie's security camera. Aware of the camera, Molino had worn a reflective vest to distort the footage. As Ellie got out of her car and walked to her front door, Molino lunged at her and pierced her thigh.
This absorption through injection allowed her to linger for a few minutes as she languished away in death, calling out for help, hoping against hope that she was going to survive, and in the end.
Ellie was clearly in pain and miserable, and she was telling her mother to call 911. Well, her mother speaks very little English, and so it was difficult for her to make the phone call. And then not long after, Ellie started to have a seizure, and foam started to come from her mouth, and she lost her consciousness, and she never regained it.
This would have sent her into a state where she was experiencing what are referred to as agonal respirations, or potentially the death rattle, as her lungs are filling with fluid. One of the reasons that cyanide is such an effective killer is the fact that it attacks both the lungs and the heart and the central nervous system. It causes almost an immediate shutdown.
Just 2 days after her birthday, Ellie was rushed to Centara Princess Hospital.
She died the next day. Her parents were told that she was brain dead. She was on life support once she arrived at the hospital, or placed on life support. And her parents were told eventually that she was brain dead and there was nothing they could do, and they had to make the decision as to whether to take her off of life support or not. And it took a while, I think, for them to make that decision, because it was hard for them to understand that she's not coming back.
Investigators would later make another startling discovery. Hidden inside the walls of his business premises was a compound known as DMSO.
Dimethyl sulfoxide is actually an agent that breaks down a barrier that we commonly have on our skin that allows for absorption. DSMO, as it's commonly referred to, kind of opens or breaks that barrier, and it's absorbed directly into the skin. It's highly effective. To me, that was quite striking, the planning phase of this. The combination of DSMO and a cyanide is the idea that potentially Joseph thought that if he combined these two substances, it would ensure that it was directly absorbed into Ellie's system. There was not going to be some off chance. He was not going to leave any stone unturned in this particular case. He wanted to make sure that all of his bases were covered. And Joseph was willing to go to great lengths, even if it meant killing Ellie, to exact his revenge.
Using cyanide alone, as it turned out, Molino had rendered Ellie's body so toxic, even medical examiners could have been at risk.
One of the particularly scary things about dealing with poisonings from cyanide is that not only is it lethal to the individual who has passed on, but also to the individuals that are going to be doing the examination on the body. So when Ellie's body would have been examined, there was a certain risk that was taken on by the medical examiner staff as they began to dissect her remains in the autopsy room. So when operating in this environment, even in the morgue, the technicians would have had to have been very, very careful using breathing apparatus, for instance, making sure that their hands were particularly covered. It's important also to keep in mind that one of the things that occurs during an autopsy is the fact that bone has to be sawed through, and it's at this point in time that things become aerosolized. So this is floating about in the air in the morgue environment. Any of the technicians there could have readily inhaled some of this.
Within 48 hours of Ellie's attack, police arrested Molino and prepared to raid his house.
Well, they just sent out a tweet saying that there was an area that was closed off and to asking people in the area to avoid it. And it was just kind of a warning, like, please don't drive by here, please don't come near. I believe they sent hazmat and probably some bomb squad people. There was concern that he had purchased a lot of fertilizer, I believe, and that, there was concerns about what type of weapons he might have there.
In the investigation of this particular case, this guy has obviously acquired cyanide, and you really don't know what form it's in. Is it in a liquid form? Is it a powder form? Is it in some kind of gas container? You really don't know. So now the investigators, just like in the morgue, have to put on personal protection equipment to be able to go into this environment to deal with this highly, highly toxic substance that could kill any one of them if they touch it, if they inhalate it, if they happen to draw it to their mouth in some way. If it makes it into their body, it will kill them as well. So this is a very lethal combination that you have going on here.
What investigators discovered pointed to a man with a dogged obsession with ending an innocent woman's life. Molino was denied bail.
He had used his laptop repeatedly to search things like cyanide and how much cyanide would kill someone, and stainless steel syringes, and I believe gas masks. And then there was the purchase that he made through Etsy, an online service, and he bought a stainless steel syringe from there. And it was delivered apparently to a pizza restaurant. And one of the women who works there said that he had eaten there every day for several days, and one day she saw him walk out with a package. So we assume that that's when the syringe was delivered.
He went to great lengths in planning. He goes so far as to order online a very interesting device. It's a vintage syringe. There was a tremendous amount of evidence that indicated that Joseph had been seeking out agents in order to take someone's life.
As well as displaying his sinister online purchases, the contents of Molino's laptop revealed the reach of his alibi.
He had a new girlfriend in China. He was trying to establish an alibi. He was hoping to get his girlfriend to create an online chat between the two of them. He was even telling her, like, put emojis in here and different details that he thought would be helpful to make it look real.
Emails, meanwhile, pointed to his escape plan.
He had a plane ticket to China, so it sounds like he was planning to leave without his daughter.
Molino's attempts to cover his tracks unraveled within days of murdering the mother of his child.
One of the things that he utilized was this perceived family connection between himself and the mob. There is a gentleman that bears the same name that he does. He attempted to imply, at least, that this individual was involved in Ellie's death, and of course that was not the case.
Despite being held in custody, Molino continued to craft a web of cowardly lies in an attempt to worm his way out of facing justice.
There was also some letters, and I believe maybe emails, that he sent to his new girlfriend in China and to his mother. They were written in code, and the letters were sent to the FBI to have an analyst look over them and determine what they were saying. And she said it just took her a matter of minutes to break the code. But he was trying to tell them how to establish an alibi for him. He was trying to get his girlfriend to create an online chat between the two of them so that he could establish that he was communicating with her at the time and it couldn't have happened. And he was trying to get his mother to help him work on this alibi as well.
The 5-day trial against Joseph Molino was held in June 2018. And from the start, Molino attempted to manipulate proceedings. His stature was now as mean as his nature.
He had also gone on a hunger strike before this, and prosecutors were of the belief that he was maybe trying to make his appearance look different, that, maybe it being thinner would make the jurors think that that's not the person that they saw on the surveillance video that was shown in court. We don't hear from the defendant often. They typically do not testify, so that was unusual. His testimony was a bit shocking. He was just so adamant that he wasn't there and that he seemed very sure of himself. He seemed like he was convinced that he was going to be acquitted. He claimed that it was a computer that probably a half dozen people in his cell phone repair business had access to. He was trying to imply that maybe someone else had made those searches, but everything about the computer seemed to be related to him personally. Like if you started to type in an address, it immediately filled in his own home address. And so the prosecutors were arguing that it was a personal laptop and it was not a business computer.
Ellie's family, meanwhile, watched on.
They knew that he had been abusive with her. They knew that he had been violent. But I don't think they knew all of the details. And I'm sure it was difficult for them to learn that, afterward, and to not have been able to protect her from this. Ellie's mother was very difficult to watch. It was very sad that she had to witness that she had to see her daughter suffering like that, and then knowing that it was someone that was supposed to have loved her, I'm sure was very difficult.
Seemingly without a semblance of shame, Molino resorted to staging mysterious illnesses, at one point even being wheeled into the courtroom strapped to a hospital gurney and refusing to speak. The jury was unconvinced. On Friday, the 22nd of June, 2018, they left the court to reach a verdict.
But the evidence was strong in this case. The computer searches, the video surveillance, the background of the prior assaults on her, the testimony from her mother about what she saw and what she knew of their relationship. And it was only an hour and a half before they came back with a verdict.
Molino was found guilty of first-degree murder. It took the jury just 15 minutes to hand down his sentence. Life in prison.
One of her sisters had come from Vietnam for the trial, and she testified in the sentencing phase. And it was just a tremendous relief for them to know not only that justice was served, but that this man was likely never going to be out to hurt anyone else ever again. And that they would be able to raise Jolie and not have him in her life.
What struck me most about this case is the level of self-indulgence. The fact that this guy was so centered on what was so very important to him, with total disregard for this precious little girl that's left behind in the wake of this horror that he wrote, removing her mother from this world and from the lives of her family, her extended family as well, that at the end it was all about them.
I'm sure it's something they're never going to get over, especially knowing now what they do know. But they have Jolie, and I know that that means a lot to them. And I'm sure that they're going to do the best that they can in raising her and making sure that she remembers her mother.
May 1957. A modest house in the industrial town of Bradford, England, is set to become the site of a tragic and groundbreaking death. Elizabeth Barlow would meet her premature end in a hitherto unheard of way. At the hands of her own husband.
It was virtually unknown then for someone to kill someone with insulin.
The groundbreaking thing about the Barlow case was that for the first time, it was established that insulin was present in the body of a victim that could not be explained in any way other than it being administered from outside.
Kenneth Barlow wasn't exactly the most glamorous character. He was an unemployed male nurse. There wasn't a lot going for him, really. He didn't have much money.
Elizabeth, aged just 32, was 6 years Kenneth's junior and was his second wife.
It wasn't so common back in the 50s to be married more than once, but Barlow had been married once. He had a 10-year-old child, and now he was on his second marriage. Elizabeth Barlow came from a similar sort of background to her husband. She'd worked in the local laundrette. She was not wealthy in any sense of the word.
Despite their limited income, The couple, who in May of 1957 had been married for just 11 months, seemed happy.
Elizabeth was in her early 30s. There were no signs of ill health. It emerged that she was 2 months pregnant.
Already trying to survive on Elizabeth's meagre income, times were tough for the family. With 3 mouths to feed, providing for a 4th would be a strain. On the 3rd of May, 1957, Elizabeth Barlow picked up some fish and chips on her way home from work. Enjoying them with her husband and stepson, she had apparently felt poorly later that evening and took herself off to bed. Kenneth claimed that Elizabeth had later vomited on herself and the bedclothes. Wanting to clean herself, she had run a bath and, according to Barlow, had fallen asleep.
Kenneth had found her unconscious. He tried to do artificial respiration on her in the bath, but it didn't work.
Kenneth ran to his neighbour's house, beat on the door, and asked the neighbour to telephone for a doctor as his wife had been taken ill.
This is 1957. We have to remember not everyone had landline phones then.
And the Barlows did not have a telephone themselves, so the neighbour telephoned for a doctor who arrived very quickly and went round to the Barlows' house. The doctor found Mrs. Barlow in a bath, dead, and apparently she had drowned.
By the time the doctor arrived, the 32-year-old's lifeless body, arms folded across her chest, lay partially submerged in the family bath. It was as if she was asleep, deathly still and perfectly arranged.
The bath water that was left in the bath was very, very low, and yet they found in the crook of her arm at the side of the bath water. Now that could have only gotten to that point had the bathtub been a lot more full. So it tended to indicate that the bathtub was full, someone had let all the water out till there was about an inch left and then put the plug back in then at the bottom. So it did look as if Kenneth had tampered with the scene before he called the medical authorities.
The doctor who was called to see her was suspicious that it wasn't a natural death, because it's very unusual for otherwise healthy people to die from drowning in a bath. He called a forensic pathologist who was convinced that it was something not right going on. And so it became a coroner's case almost immediately.
The police came soon afterwards, and it was noticed that although Kenneth Barlow was saying that his wife had drowned and he'd tried to give her manual artificial respiration, there was no sign of water splashing on the bathroom floor. There was no sign that Kenneth Barlow's clothing was wet.
Police were also very bothered because if she had been resuscitated in the way that Kenneth Barlow said he had, then why was there still some water in the crook of her elbow?
And it just started to look suspicious from quite early on.
If Elizabeth was unconscious before she had been placed in the bathtub, the question for investigators was how had she lost consciousness?
They took the body down to the hospital and they had a post-mortem within 6 hours of poor Elizabeth being found. Now that is extremely quick. But what it does mean is that the medical authorities are able to capture the body when all the organs are still fresh, and they can find out medically why she was found dead in the bath.
A search of the house turned up other curious discoveries and potential leads.
They looked very carefully for something that might indicate there was something going on. They found a syringe. It is interesting that a syringe was found.
So what the medical authorities did, they took the body out about a week later and did a microscopic examination of her body and her skin. And they found in her buttocks 2 hypodermic syringe entry points. So clearly she'd been injected, but it was in a position where she could not have done it herself.
Barlow was quizzed about the presence of the needle pricks found on Elizabeth.
And he was questioned about it, and he said that he had injected her with a substance called ergometrin, which was said to be a useful thing for producing an abortion. She was actually 8 weeks pregnant.
In the 1950s, performing an abortion on a mentally and physically fit mother and fetus in the UK was still a criminal offence. Knowing this, Kenneth claimed he and Elizabeth had instead decided to try and terminate the pregnancy themselves.
But they'd already tested her body for ergometrin and there wasn't any there, so they knew that he was lying.
At the Barlow house, investigators had picked up other clues.
Elizabeth's pyjamas were found crumpled up in the laundry basket and they were soaking wet. And it was assumed that this was due to sweat.
Meanwhile, investigators were securing more leads, this time from ex-colleagues.
He was a nurse, and nurses have to know a bit about insulin because it is so widely used for the treatment of people with diabetes.
They went to where Kenneth used to be employed before he lost his job, and they became concerned because ex-colleagues used to say that Kenneth used to discuss how easy it was to kill someone with insulin.
It's almost certain that there were the occasional murder cases before Barlow. Statistically, they occur once or twice every year in the whole world somewhere. It was impossible to prove it, so no case had ever come to court, but probably it had been done. One of the major features of hypoglycemia, low blood sugar produced by insulin, that it causes the patient to sweat very profusely, even though they're not particularly hot. In fact, they're usually cold. That was another piece of evidence. It is all consistent with the hypothesis, which is how the scientific investigation of any case should progress. You start off with a hypothesis, you then set about testing it. In this case, the test was to look for insulin, which they found. You then say, are there other things that are consistent with this pattern? And that's exactly what they did find.
That would then account for the clothing that they'd found, the pajamas that were very wet, would account for why she may have vomited before she became unconscious, and it would account for the fact that she drowned in the bath because she wasn't able to save herself.
Insulin is used by diabetics to help regulate their blood sugar. But there was a problem. Elizabeth was not a diabetic.
Insulin is an essential part of our lives. It's made in our own bodies, and it controls the concentration of glucose or sugar in the blood, which is terribly important because it's the fuel that the brain relies on. And if it falls too low, the brain stops working. It starts off by misbehaving and making us feel unwell and feeling shaky and sweating and feeling blurred vision and so on. If it continues to fall even more, we lose consciousness. And if it carries on, we go into coma. And if that's not relieved by somebody giving us some sugar, we die.
Police learnt that Barlow not only understood the impacts of insulin, but had access to vials of it when he worked at the hospital. The question was whether Elizabeth had overdosed from an insulin intake.
At post-mortem, somebody removes the tissues around those puncture wounds and thought, can we see if there's any insulin in it? They eventually found a pharmaceutical company, Boots of Nottingham, who said that they would try to use the same method that they use for measuring insulin in their pharmaceutical products, which they did by extracting the tissues that had been removed. And they, using the very crude method that they had, because it was still very crude, they managed to show that there was something like 80 units of insulin in Elizabeth's buttocks, which is about 10 times the typical dose that would be given at any one time. And it was in a position that she couldn't have injected it herself.
Barlow couldn't explain the presence of insulin in his wife's body.
There really was no disputing the facts in that case that insulin was present in her body, and the fact that it was in a position that she couldn't have injected herself ruled out suicide, which is much more common than murder.
In this case, Elizabeth had been given an overdose of insulin, and it caused her to become unconscious, and eventually she would have lapsed into a coma.
Elizabeth's death was deemed suspicious. There was no reasonable justification for such quantities of insulin to be found in her body. With no one else in the house possessing a knowledge of or access to insulin, Kenneth Barlow became the police's prime suspect.
People were writing this in fiction before the Barlow case. They had known that it was a possibility because we knew that animals would die if you gave them insulin and left them. So it was not a novel idea, but it was the first time it was proven and became public knowledge, as it were.
They arrested Kenneth, they put him in an interview room, and he vehemently denied it. He said, "No, I did not do this. I did not do this." He said, "I've told you what I've done, but I did not inject my wife with insulin." Nevertheless, the police charged him with murder on the basis of the medical evidence.
While the medical evidence was compelling, establishing a motive was more challenging.
The motive in this Kenneth Barlow case is very difficult to establish because they seemed to have an amicable marriage.
We could say the motive is he doesn't want his wife to have the baby. But to go to the extremes of doing something like injecting insulin, which has got nothing to do with inducing a miscarriage, that is out and out cold and calculating, designed to kill Elizabeth. Had it been that he had given her a drug to induce an abortion, then we could actually argue that perhaps Kenneth didn't mean to kill his wife. But the finding of insulin and the medical authorities saying no, it was insulin, really leaves no room for doubt that if Kenneth injected her with insulin, he intended to kill her.
While the Crown prosecutors may not have had a robust motive, they did possess irrefutable medical evidence. The world's first trial of the homicidal use of insulin began in December 1957 at Leeds Assizes, when Barlow was brought up from the holding cells beneath the court. He pleaded not guilty. But 5 days later, on Friday the 13th of December, the jury delivered their verdict.
He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. So Kenneth went into prison. It was a full verdict, as it would have been in those days. All 12 members of the jury guilty of murder.
I think that it was not surprising that they didn't have to take very long. Kenneth Barlow was the very first person ever to be convicted of killing somebody with insulin. The truth of the matter is, he didn't actually succeed in killing her with insulin. He had to drown her, but he used the insulin to render her unconscious so that she could be drowned.
It was December 1957, just before Christmas, so the tragedy is, again, his poor children, his poor child, would have had a pretty miserable time of it.
Kenneth Barlow spent the next 27 years behind bars.
And he served a long time and wasn't actually released until 1984. He, of course, vehemently denied it, not only at the time, but having served 20 plus years in jail, when he's released in 1984, he still protested his innocence and said, "I did not inject my wife with insulin." So it's really a bit of an unsolved mystery as to why he did it and what were the motives that drove him.
Was it about not having children because neither of them wanted to have any children? Or was there some other, more complex reason behind all this? Whatever the truth of the matter, he's taken that mystery to his grave.